Welcome back to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. My name is Derek Brown. In today's video, we are going to discuss early wide receiver bust candidates. But before we get to all of those names, I have to introduce you to the sponsor of this video, BetterHelp. If you have not given therapy a try, I implore you to take that step today. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First thing you got to do, go to their site, betterhelp.com/fantasypros. You answer a few questions and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience. You can do this all from your phone or your computer, however you feel most comfortable. It's the easiest possible way to start talking to a therapist. You'll be matched to a therapist usually within 48 hours so you can get started quickly. Again, visit betterhelp.com/fantasypros to get started and also enjoy a special discount on your first month. All right, let's get to these wide receivers. All right, first wide receiver up here on the list, number 10, Cooper Kupp. In the 12 games we saw Kupp and Puka Nacua on the field together last year, this was Puka Nacua's show. He bested Kupp in target share, air yard share, yards per route run, end zone targets, and yes, I know after the fallout of all of those categories, fantasy points per game. In that stretch, those 12 games, both these wide receivers were on the field together. Puka Nacua was the wide receiver 12 in fantasy points per game scoring, while Kupp was the wide receiver 23. Kupp, another year older, and Puka entering his second season in the league. Can he distance himself more from Cooper Kupp, a wide receiver who right now is the wide receiver 23 in ECR? If we see that happen, Cooper Kupp could be hard-pressed to return a wide receiver 2 price tag, or at least wide receiver 2 production this year. Okay, next guy on the list. I know people are going to hate this because everybody loves to talk about him, and I get the production was awesome, but we've got to discuss the floor and the outcomes for Jayden Reed. Last year, wide receiver 26 in fantasy points per game. It's amazing. It's awesome. Super productive as a rookie. So why am I telling you to have tempered expectations? Because Jayden Reed did all of this with only a 58% route per dropback rate. He wasn't even a full-time player in the Green Bay Packers offense, as well as he didn't even command a 17% target share. And for players, we always talk about volume is king. That's volume of snaps, volume of routes, volume of targets. Which one of these things are we grabbing a hold to for Jayden Reed? I understand, look, he was good when he was out there on the field. Can he be a full-time player in the Packers offense and take a step forward if Christian Watson is healthy? If Dontavian Wicks also takes a step forward in his second year, and all of these other skill players that Green Bay is going to trot out. If they roll out a wide receiver committee again this season, Jayden Reed could disappoint. He's wide receiver 35 in ECR right now. And again, he was the wide receiver 43 in expected fantasy points per game last season. Tread cautiously with Jayden Reed. Next player we got to mention here, Hollywood Brown, number 8 on my list. Last year, amongst 126 qualifying wide receivers, Hollywood Brown was 29th in target share, 31st in first read share. Okay, the volume's good. That's great. He didn't do anything with it though. So how are we going to feel when he's transitioning to a new team? He has a litany, a history of foot injuries that, again, he was injured last year. We can't project full health this year. He was 72nd, people, in yards per route run, 52nd in first downs per route run, 65th in fantasy points per route run. As a player, look, all we need is a few training clips to sit here and populate the timeline, and people are going to dive right in on Hollywood Brown. I am going to be staying away because I'm worried he could bust this season. Next player up, number 7 on the list, Chris Godwin. Wide receiver 23 in expected fantasy points per game last season, and I know he underperformed. How much of that is age, worries, injuries, maybe this offense? For a player that, yes, he was the wide receiver 34 in fantasy points per game. That was awesome. It was a lot of volume. And can he reproduce that when Chris Godwin at this stage, the Buccaneers roll back last year's offense this year, it was all short area stuff. And so can he produce big plays? Because he was 54th in deep targets. So the deep heaves that are going to give him spike weeks It's tough. It's tough to get there unless you're going to see just overwhelming volume. And Baker Mayfield being the guy that Baker Mayfield was last year. Dave Canellis being gone. How much does this hurt this offense? Unless Chris Godwin is breaking tackles and making things happen, he could be hard-pressed to pay off this year for a wide receiver that was 76th in ADOT and also 47th in yak per reception. All right, continuing on the worrisome wide receivers that are getting a little bit older, we have to have a real conversation about Amari Cooper. Was he really good last year with Deshaun Watson on the field? Sure. Does that happen again in the year 2024? For a quarterback in Deshaun Watson, amongst 48 qualifying quarterbacks last year, was 31st in yards per attempt, 36th in highly accurate throw rate. He had the 15th highest off-target rate in the NFL. So right now, my concerns are not so much with Amari Cooper busting because of Amari Cooper being bad. I'm worried about the quarterback play in Cleveland. Is Deshaun Watson going to bounce back? Can he be, at least serviceable, good? And yes, I know we can all point back to last year's sample. It was such a small sample of 5 games that we delve in these small samples, that even putting a lot of faith in Cooper outperforming in those 5 games and carrying that over to a full season this year, it's a difficult bet to make. And I don't know if I'm going to be making it this year with Amari Cooper, and especially where he's going in drafts. Okay, number 5. I love him. I'm not going to throw too much shade at him. Really, really love the player, and I told everybody to draft him last year. I'm pumping the brakes a little bit. I'm slightly pressing the panic button a little bit with Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen last year was amazing. Any way you want to slice this, amongst all wide receivers, at least 150 routes run last year, was 2nd in target share, 3rd in targets per route run, 11th in yards per route run. Can he reproduce that in Chicago? Even if we want to just talk about the narrative of, okay, wide receivers changing teams, and can you be that productive? Because we know he had an awesome connection with Justin Herbert. Does that translate to Caleb Williams? Remains to be seen. Am I saying that it's time to put him out to pasture? It's time for the old wide receivers and he falls off a cliff and all that type of stuff? Or not even baking in any of the injury risk stuff? Not even talking about all that. Can he continue to earn targets at that type of insane clip when you're adding him into Chicago? And he's never been a touchdown weapon as well. So it's not like the touchdowns are going to absolutely just help him. He was 54th in end zone targets last season. All of those targets he got last year, he only got 5 end zone targets. Now, maybe that changes in Chicago. It's a tough bet to make on an aging wide receiver. Number 4 on the list, and there's going to be a lot of hype because we love rookies and we love players that are tied to Josh Allen's arm. Keon Coleman could bust this year. And I know the price tag is not high right now in early drafts. He's the wide receiver 50 in ECR. But look, that takes one training camp clip. One training clip of him running routes versus the air, get high pointing a ball and coming down with it from Josh Allen, and everybody's cheering. And then all of a sudden, Keon Coleman's getting bumped up the line. He'll be a wide receiver 4. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a low-end wide receiver 3 in some rankings by the time we hit week 1. And again, this is an early video, but I could see the groundswell coming up for Keon Coleman. And I'm worried about it. And I'm worried about where he sits in this Buffalo passing attack. I think Buffalo added a guy, but they're building a basketball team. They added another guy that could possibly be their red zone weapon, the X. Play a role where can he come down with some of those passes? Sure. But how often is he getting those passes? I don't project Keon Coleman's going to be a high-end 25%, 23% target share earner in the NFL, as well as if you look at the context of this offense for Buffalo, weeks 11 through 18, they were 13th in red zone rushing rate. So a lot of the opportunities inside the 20 were not going to the passing game. They were going to Josh Allen's legs. They're going to go to the running backs. Do we see that change this year for Joe Brady? Possible, but it can't be written in stone. So yes, I'm very worried about Keon Coleman this season. Okay, number 3 on the list. We've got a player that I've loved for many, many seasons, but tied to the arm of Will Levis. Again, we got to worry here. Calvin Ridley right now is the wide receiver 34 in ECR. I can make you an argument. I would much rather be drafting DeAndre Hopkins at his current price tag at wide receiver 39 in ECR over Calvin Ridley. If Hopkins is the wide receiver, the clear wide receiver 1 in this offense, and then it's not Ridley, Ridley's going to have some problems here. Is he the wide receiver 4? Is he going to put wide receiver 4 production guy? Because people are talking about that. That's DeAndre Hopkins right now. What if it's not? DeAndre didn't look washed last year. He also walks into this season with already having a rapport with Will Levis. And let's not get this twisted. How many skill players can Will Levis support in fantasy at a high level? Quarterbacking play, I mean, look, we got to mention it. The quarterbacking play limits the ceiling and lowers the floor on plenty of wide receivers in the fantasy realm and the NFL realm. Could Calvin Ridley be kiboshed by Will Levis? It's possible. 48 qualifying quarterbacks. I know I talked about this list earlier with Deshaun Watson. Bears mentioning again with Will Levis. He was 42nd in adjusted completion rate last year, Will Levis was. And 42nd in catchable target rate. It's not great, people. So if Calvin Ridley is not getting as many targets as DeAndre Hopkins, and they're not great targets because they're coming from Will Levis, could be set up for a one-way ticket to Bustville. Just saying. Could happen. All right, let's get into the top 2 of this list on these early wide receiver bust candidates. Number 2 here, Jalen Waddle. And I know people don't want to hear this name discussed. He's still the ECR wide receiver 19. So people are buying right back in after last year, after the pain that they felt by having Jalen Waddle on their squads last year. Yes, I understand. And the first thing people are going to mention in the comments, and you're going to come back at me and say, whoa, hold up. Jalen Waddle was wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game. What are you talking about? Tua's still there. Tyreek's still there. Jalen Waddle's still good. And they added more competition around Jalen Waddle. I don't have a problem with the talent of Jalen Waddle, but we have to discuss last year and the additions of Jonnu Smith. They didn't have a decent tight end to draw targets there for Miami last year. And Odell Beckham Jr. And say what you want about Odell at his current iteration of his skill, talent, and things like that in his career right now. Still looked pretty good when he was out there for Baltimore last year. Is he good enough to draw some targets away from Jalen Waddle when last year this was all the Tyreek Hill show and Jalen Waddle going along for the ride? What does that do in 2024? And Jalen Waddle last year, we saw kind of shaky. If you had Jalen Waddle in your fantasy teams, you already know. You already know what it was like to have Jalen Waddle and say, do I play him on a weekly basis? Do I not? So while the full season numbers look great, the per week numbers, the game numbers are not good. He was the wide receiver 27 in expected fantasy points per game. That's not great, and I get he outkicked that and finishes a wide receiver 2, as well as in 57% of his games last season, people. Jalen Waddle finished outside the top 24 wide receivers in weekly fantasy scoring. Does that number improve? Tyreek Hill remaining, the additions of Jonnu Smith, the addition of Odell Beckham Jr. I can't definitively tell you that it does. Without further ado, we move on to the biggest bust potential wide receiver in fantasy this year. You could draw parallels to target competition and all that. I mean, basically, he's just another version of Keenan Allen. We've got to mention Stefon Diggs and the worries that you should have when you're drafting Stefon Diggs. Just start this conversation the way we should. Let's put respect on Nico Collins and Tank Dell's names. They were fantastic last year. Tank Dell broke out as a rookie. He was awesome until he got injured. Nico Collins, one of the most efficient wide receivers in the NFL, bar none, last year. And when everybody else crumbled around him, Nico Collins also proved he could be a true alpha, drawing massive amounts of targets, massive target shares. Is Stefon Diggs really still that guy at this stage of his career? Weeks 1 through 9, you can make a really good case. Yes, he emphatically was. Looking at, in those 9 weeks, 5 100-yard receiving games. Wide receiver 4 in fantasy points per game. You could stop the conversation right there and be like, oh, no, what are you talking about with Stefon Diggs? But that's not where the conversation ended. The rest of the season, weeks 10 through 18, Stefon Diggs finished above 80 receiving yards in one game. You can count it on one hand. One game. He was the wide receiver 45 or higher in weekly fantasy scoring only twice. He was the wide receiver 52 in fantasy points per game in that stretch. So now you're adding Stefon Diggs to a target tree that includes Nico Collins and Tank Dell. Again, we talked about it. 2 supremely talented young wide receivers. Is Stefon Diggs going to be able to still draw targets at the same clip we've expected his entire career? Or is he closer to being the guy that we saw down the back half of this last season. Remains to be seen, but we'll see. Dive into early drafts, people. Use the mock draft simulator. Get ready. Redraft season is coming.